As World War II tore the world apart, the people who fought its battles faced challenges that those who never experienced it could never imagine. While the war raged, millions of people were beaten, tortured, slaughtered, and imprisoned. Never in human history had there been a war with so much bloodshed and heartbreak. With the entire world thrown into war and countless battles being fought simultaneously, millions of people found themselves as prisoners of war, or POWs. For many, being captured was not the end of the war, for so many of these people had to cling on to existence itself with every ounce of willpower they could muster, as they prayed and hoped the war would come to an end, and hopefully with it, the end of their long and painful captivity. In this video, we're going to look at the conditions that POWs would be faced with throughout the war. Conditions varied a great deal between which country was holding their prisoners and what nationalities or ethnicities the prisoners were. To get a better picture of what one could expect as a POW, I will look into the United States and Germany and how these nations treated their prisoners. For the United States, the housing of prisoners of war was one of their immediate endeavors upon entering the war. The United Kingdom had been fighting the Germans for over 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The small island nation had been collecting German POWs for years, and they were running critically low on housing for their prisoners. Once the United States and Germany officially declared war on each other on December 11, 1941, the British government requested the United States to accept 175,000 prisoners of war. The United States accepted these German POWs and immediately began constructing camps to house them. In World War II, the United States would ship over 30,000 prisoners of war every month from the battlefield to the United States. It is important to remember that the United States of late 1941 and early 1942 was a very different United States than the one that exists today. The United States was largely an isolationist nation who did not want to participate in any European war, especially after the experiences of World War I. This was not the global superpower that we all know today. The United States was unsure how to even hold large amounts of POWs, as they had very little experience with them. The United States government had very little preparation in terms of logistics to house so many prisoners, and they feared that the POWs would cause widespread fear and pose a national security problem. Despite their concerns, the U.S. quickly got to work constructing over 700 POW camps spread out across the country. The government established guidelines on where these camps should be constructed and how the prisoners should be treated. The camps were to be constructed in mild climates in the country and far away from urban or industrial locations to minimize the security risks that come with having hundreds of thousands of individuals who belong to a nation that is at war with the United States. According to the international laws regarding the treatment of POWs that were established by the Geneva Convention, the United States was permitted to use POWs as labor, but only if the prisoners were compensated for their work. The United States government took full advantage of this by placing a majority of the camps in areas that they believed would struggle to maintain food production across the southern and southwestern parts of the United States. With this, the United States had a plan. They would ship hundreds of thousands of POWs to the southern United States and have them work on farms to help bolster the American food supply. But how did this plan affect the lives of the prisoners who were forced to live in these camps? As the war grew more brutal throughout the war, a German soldier would often find themselves relieved to know they had been captured by the Americans and not another member of the Allied powers. As they boarded American Liberty ships, the treatment they would receive would often surprise them, as they were fed large meals on the ships headed to their prison camp in the United States. Remember, the Germans, especially later in the war, suffered from food shortages. Late in the war, the German soldier had become used to seeing and hearing about their cities being bombed into oblivion, and hearing how much their people were sacrificing to continue the war. When these German soldiers arrived in America, they were stunned to see how different America was compared to their fatherland. They had been fighting America as best they could throughout the war, and when these soldiers arrived in the United States, it had to be disheartening to see how well the Americans were living. They were not only surviving, America was prospering through the war. When they arrived at their camps, they were separated by their rank and placed into their housing. The housing they received in America was similar to the housing that the American military members received. The enlisted German soldiers were allowed 40 square feet of living space, while the officers were granted 120 square feet. Generals and admirals were given bungalows with their own private gardens. One German prisoner of war named Gunther Grahl commented on his treatment in his prison camp in Washington with, quote, "It was in August or September 1944 when I stood in front of a shop in the POW camp at Fort Lewis considering what to buy first. An ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I was able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola, never before. So I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." End quote. The German soldiers would be forced to work in agricultural production, but would be paid for their work. The Germans were then allowed to use their money to buy goods they normally would never have access to in Germany. After their work was done, the Germans were offered a variety of entertainment options, including live performances, board games, sports, and even educational classes. Despite the United States having well over 450,000 Axis prisoners, less than 1% of these ever bothered attempting to escape. Some German prisoners were allowed outside of the prisons without guards on the basis of an honor system. These prisoners were even allowed to eat in restaurants that black Americans were forbidden to eat at due to Jim Crow laws. Overall, the Americans, as well as the British, treated their POWs better than any other great power in World War II.